Hello and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, you can do so by popping along to Patreon, that's patreon.com/the History Network. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 32, episode 1, The Gothic Genius of Fritigern, part 1. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. The Gothic leader Fritigern, possibly based on the Gothic Frithugairns, is perhaps one of the most underappreciated commanders in the ancient world. At the head of a complex federation of Gothic tribes, he imposed a devastating defeat on the forces of the Western Roman Empire at the Battle of Adrianople, or Hadrianople, on August 9th, AD 378. This defeat, where the Romans were commanded by the Eastern Emperor Valens in person, has long been recognised as one of the watershed moments of military history. There has been some revisionism towards the significance of the battle in recent years, downplaying its importance and impact, but it was once considered the moment that the Roman Empire ended and the Middle Ages began. This calamitous day, when Valens met his death and his army was utterly destroyed, was certainly recognised by contemporary historians as of huge significance. The Gothic cavalry charge, which devastated the Roman legions, has also been seen as the origin of the heavy cavalry armies which would dominate warfare for more than a millennium. These theories are rejected today, since they assume that the Goths used the stirrup, actually introduced to Europe in the 6th century and probably first taken advantage of by Charlemagne. Accounts of the battle, however, have long focused on the failings of the Romans and their emperor, rather than on any deliberate and intentional plan by Fritigern. There is more than enough evidence in our sources to support a view of Fritigern as the architect of an overwhelming Gothic victory on that August day, however, and this, in turn, leads to a reassessment of his qualities as a commander. Multiple sources refer to the catastrophe that befell the Roman Empire at Adrianople. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus called it the darkest disaster which ever fell upon the state. The most reliable source for the battle and the period remains Marcellinus, a contemporary from Antioch and a military veteran. He concluded his history of the Roman Empire with the disaster at Adrianople. Yet there is optimism in Ammianus. He states that those who called it the worst disaster that ever befell the Romans were ignorant of their history. Rome had experienced and recovered from worse disasters. Ammianus believed that the general would arise who would overcome the Goths, just as they had in crises past. Only half of Ammianus's work survives, but this portion deals with the 25 years from 354 to 378, all within the span of Ammianus's own lifetime. The first 13 books, which are lost, covered the history of the empire from AD 96 to 353. Other sources for the period survive in various states, such as the histories of Zosimus, Eunapius, and Jordanes, or the church writers Sozomen and Socrates. Often these writers did not focus on military history, but they can still be useful. Fritigern and Adrianople give lie to the common phrase "winners write history," since despite his victory and the permanent establishment of the Gothic peoples within the Roman Empire in the aftermath of the battle, their version of events does not survive. All our accounts are Roman, whether written in Latin or Greek, and this has slanted our view of both the battle and the man. We therefore have the Latinization of the names of tribes and individuals. In many cases, our sources themselves are inconsistent. Names of individuals can vary wildly to the extent that sometimes it appears as if two individuals are being discussed, when in fact it is one, and vice versa. For instance, Ammianus names the Gothic child king both Vythericus and Videricus, although there is no known portrait of Fritigern. Certain aspects of Gothic clothing, decoration, hair and facial hair, armour and weapons are known. Depictions of the Goths are difficult to date precisely to the period of the Battle of Adrianople, but sculptures showing them earlier in the 4th century are remarkably similar to those which date from later and even from the 5th century. The styles of hair, helmet, swords and armour here are all typically Gothic for the period and drawn from a variety of sources showing Gothic warriors. We first meet Fritigern in Ammianus as one of the leaders of the Thuringian Goths crossing into the Roman Empire over the river Danube in 376 AD. Another of the leaders at the same time was Athanaric. They, as well as many other tribes, were under pressure from the Huns further to the east, and had been forced to flee their homes. The Thuringian Goths, or simply Thuringi, had become Romanized throughout the 4th century through contact with the empire. This had been through trade and employment in the Roman army. They had also been converted to Arian Christianity by Wulfila earlier in the century. Many of our sources focus on this. Valens was also an Arian and was persecuting Nicene Christians. Those Nicene writers see his defeat and death as a punishment of his heretical Arian faith, and they ignore that it was the Arian Goths who inflicted it. We get no background on Fritigern when he is introduced. Other writers, such as Sozomen and Socrates, who both wrote histories of the Church, introduce him earlier in order to deal with his conversion to Arian Christianity. This version has Fritigern as a rival leader to Athanaric among the Thuringi. According to Sozomen, who names him Fritigernese, Fritigern asked Valens for assistance in his war against Athanaric, and in return he and his people converted to the religion of the emperor. This version reveals perhaps another reason for the Thuringi wanting land within the empire, but it also shows high-level contact between them and the Romans, as well as the high level of Romanization of the Goths at the time. Gothic culture was made up of a series of tribes, each with its own chieftain. In our sources, these men are often described as kings. Fritigern is named as one such man, originally with another leader, Alavius, but Fritigern soon becomes the main focus of Ammianus's narrative and called king or duces. The actual organisation of the confederation of these Gothic tribes was much more complex, each with its leader who its men would follow, but they may well have reorganised, or voted for, an overall leader. Fritigern is certainly presented in such a manner, although termed king despite the fact that there were other kings within his confederation. In Ammianus and Jordanes we do get the idea that kings could be chosen, creating a new dynasty, and sometimes we have evidence of a regency by leading nobles, such as that of Alphaeus and Sparax of the Frithugairns. Athanaric is termed judge rather than king of the Thuringi, when he first appears, but he is also called king later. There may have been a variety of organisational structures within the Gothic tribes which our sources were ignorant of. There may have been lesser chiefs, like an aristocracy, and several of Fritigern's commanders fit this pattern: Farnobius, Suridus, and Callias. Both Fritigern and Alavius are termed Duces, and may have led a large section of the Thuringi who had abandoned Athanaric. We hear no more of Alavius after the banquet of Lupicinus, and it is often stated he was murdered there, but that Fritigern escaped. In 376, the Goths promised the Emperor Valens obedience and were invited into the empire to be settled in the province of Moesia on the south bank of the Danube and corresponding to parts of modern Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, North Macedonia and Serbia. Ammianus tells us that Valens considered he would have a vast number of new recruits and therefore an invincible army. Ammianus's judgment is succinct. The ruin of the Roman world was brought in with stormy eagerness by the Romans themselves. Ammianus's phrase, "the barriers of our frontiers were unlocked," suggests the idea that letting the barbarians into the Roman Empire was seen as a great error. This may have been hindsight, however. There had been earlier settlements of barbarian peoples into the empire, and modern scholars ascribe many more reasons to the fall of the Roman Empire than simply letting barbarians settle inside its borders in 376. For Ammianus and his contemporaries, however, this was the moment on which, in hindsight, they could pinpoint all their subsequent troubles. Once the Goths had been allowed to cross the Danube, Rome's commanders, Maximus and Lupicinus, mistreated the new arrivals, extorting vast sums for meagre supplies of food. Rather than being men of skill and reputation, they were, according to Ammianus, men of stained reputations. Again, Ammianus summarises that their treacherous greed was the cause of all our evils. Forced by famine and their mistreatment at the hands of the Roman commanders, Fritigern and the Thuringi revolted. At the same time, another tribe, the Gruthungi, had gathered on the far bank of the Danube and asked if they too could be admitted into the empire. They were refused, but, taking advantage of Fritigern's revolt, they also crossed into the empire. One of the remarkable aspects of Ammianus's account is how much he blames Roman actions for what was to happen at Adrianople. His description of Fritigern is full of admiration and praise. When first mentioned in more than passing, we get the description of Fritigern as, with his natural cleverness in foresight, protecting himself against anything that might happen. Fritigern has providentia, or foresight, a very Roman trait in a commander. He is also described as quick-witted, crafty, and playing both sides, wanting to appear as if he was obeying his oath to the emperor, and at the same time join up with the Gothic allies and the Gruthungi. Fritigern was invited to a banquet by Lupicinus at Marcianopolis, and there his retinue were put to the sword. His rival, Alavius, was also killed. Ammianus has him talk his way out, arguing that he could quell the concerns of his soldiers, who were becoming unruly outside the town. In Jordanes's Gothic history, however, Fritigern perceived of the plot against him and escaped, cutting his way through the perfidious Romans with sword in hand and rescuing his remaining men. Despite the romanticism of this account, it actually seems more likely than that Fritigern was able to talk his way out of an assassination plot. Fleeing from his attempt on his life, Fritigern's men immediately began to rampage through the countryside of Thrace, taking the supplies they had been denied by the Roman commanders. Lupicinus mustered his whole force at Marcianopolis. The barbarians he faced were suffering the effects of famine and were poorly equipped, so no doubt the Romans expected a quick victory. Nonetheless, the Goths charged the Roman force without a care for their lives and defeated the Roman troops easily. They were then able to arm themselves with Roman weapons, armour and shields. Fritigern now had an army. We are given the number of 200,000 men, women and children who crossed in 376. It is impossible to tell if this is accurate, but perhaps 1/3 of that number would have been warriors, and they were strengthened by more people crossing. Even taking conservative estimates of Gothic numbers, it is clear they outnumbered the men the Romans could muster to oppose them. More Gothic tribes, some of whom had been in service in the Roman army, now joined the rebellion, and they too armed themselves with weapons of the Roman dead, especially at the city of Adrianople, where there was one of the state-owned arms factories or fabricae. There the chief magistrate, the duumvir, had armed the poor and the armourers, but they were overcome by the Goths. Fritigern quickly realised that his men were not suited to a siege. He is given the pithy phrase that he kept peace with walls, and set his men to ravaging the rich and unprotected parts of the countryside, and moved into the province of Thracia. More and more men joined the rebellion, including the Guthungi leaders Alathias and Saphrax, who would become the commanders of Fritigern's cavalry. The Emperor Valens was at Antioch when he learnt of the revolt. The threat was eventually recognised as so serious that he put off plans in the east and turned his attention to the Goths. First, though, he sent two, unfortunately poor, generals, Profuturus and Trajanus, ahead in 377. The scale of the crisis is shown by the fact that Gratian, the emperor of the West and Valens' nephew, also sent troops under Frigiderius, his commander from Pannonia, and then more with his Magister Militum Rycomeres. When these forces combined, Rycomeres took command of the whole force in 377. The combined Roman force sought the Goths. We are told that the Goths had arranged their wagons into a circle. The best equivalent seems to be the Afrikaner wagon lager seen during the Boer War. Although the Goths moved camp regularly, the Roman forces under Rycomeres kept them under surveillance. When the Goths became aware of this shadowing, either through observation or deserters, they stayed put and summoned all the marauding bands to a central position. This resulted in a standoff, although some skirmishes did break out amongst light armed troops. We are told that all the Goths and their kings were keen for war. Eventually the battle lines joined, and there was great slaughter on both sides. Despite this, the battle was indecisive, and the Romans retreated to Marcianopolis, whilst the Goths retreated inside their wagon circle. Rycomeres returned to Gaul to summon more troops, and Frigiderius to Pannonia. The Romans also fortified the mountain passes to prevent a Gothic breakout. The Goths at this juncture formed an alliance with some Huns and Heleni, or Alans, who were eager for the rich spoils to be had from the Roman provinces. The combined forces then broke out, despite the Roman measures, and ravaged the territory of Thrace and as far as the Hellespont, destroying another Roman force commanded by Brasimeres. They next turned on the forces of Frigiderius. He, however, was able to defeat a force of Goths, the Typhali, commanded by Farnobius. All of this Gothic activity is described as that of a ravaging, mindless horde breaking out and pouring over the plain of Thrace. It is worth remembering, however, that these Goths were Romanized to a large extent and had been joined by groups who had been resident within the empire for some time. We can be certain that they knew what they were doing and that there was a plan behind it. although we are not informed specifically, the likely author of that plan was Fritigern. He was attacking the Roman troops in small divisions which had withdrawn to winter quarters individually, a sound strategy. His strategy the following year, in 378, however, would reveal him to be a master. And we will find out in a couple of weeks' time just how masterful he was. Thanks again, Murray, for writing this two-part for us. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/The History Network. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.